right. Happy Wednesday, everybody. It says we are live, so I will wait for a few people to hop on. I see one person watching. So welcome to another round of Q&A. So if you are joining us, let me know. Say hi in the comments, and we'll just give a minute or so for people to get on. I've got my coffee. Hey, Debbie. Thanks for joining. Who else is out there? We only have 2 questions tonight, so if you have other questions, hi David. If you have other questions that you forgot to text in, you can comment in the comment stream there, and I will do my best. Hello from Snowy Taylor. Oh, is it snowing pretty bad? Yeah, I think it's pretty snowy here too. I'm glad I'm inside. Yeah, so if you have other questions, hey Gerald, you can comment. I've got two, like I said, two really good questions. So we'll try and answer those. But if you do have others, feel free to ask them. I watched part of our. I'll apologize for the quality last week. I don't know if it was good, but I watched the beginning of it, and the audio and the video were totally not lined up. So I think the internet in that corner of the basement of the church is not very good. So we probably won't do the live Q&A at the church again. So hopefully it wasn't too bad, and you can still listen and enjoy. So, anyways. Hi to everyone, and like I said, we have 2 questions, and I'm going to do my best to answer them. And as we go along, if you need some clarification or you have other questions that come up, you can go ahead and ask. So here's the first question. Can you dig into assisted death from a biblical perspective? So I'm assuming you're talking about like doctor-assisted suicide or euthanasia. I know it has uh, a couple different names. Nice Christmas tree, yeah, right. There's our Christmas tree. My wife has decorated already. Stockings hung by the chimney with care. Yeah, we go all out for Christmas. So can to kind of comment on assisted death. So that's the idea, and I'm not 100% sure. Someone can comment if you know. I'm pretty sure Canada wide it's allowed physician assisted suicide or euthanasia. I didn't know if every province had. I'm pretty sure Canada wide it has, but I could be wrong. Someone can comment if you know more than I do. But essentially, it's the idea of, if you are suffering and you're close to the end of your life, or if you have like a terminal illness, you can decide to tell your doctor, I just want to die. I don't want to go through this pain or suffering anymore. And then I'm not even 100% sure if it's an injection or a pill or whatever it is, but they essentially, for lack of a better term, it's really what it is that they mercy kill you. It's pretty gruesome, in my opinion. So, from a biblical perspective, then, I'll say, first of all, from our culture's perspective, the way that it's kind of pitched or painted, this idea of like assisting people in ending their lives. Like terminology matters. They use a lot of pretty terminology to spice up the fact that they're killing people. And it's always painted as, well, it's the merciful thing to do. We're trying to help people die with dignity. Why should anyone suffer? You should have a choice if you don't want to suffer anymore. And it's painted as as a good thing, right? We're just helping people die with dignity, and we don't want people to suffer anymore. And so it does. I get it. It kind of tugs at your heartstrings a little bit if you think about, okay, so here's, here's 90-year-old Beth, and she's had cancer for 5 years, and the doctors say they can't do anything about it, and she's in pain every day. And so it's kind of presented as this, really, do you want her to suffer? Like, just allow her to end her life, and then she won't be in pain anymore. So, a couple of thoughts biblically. One, so I guess like just cut and dry, biblically, that is horrendous. It's murder, well, or suicide, but it's killing someone. And the Bible's really clear if you wanted to go just straight up. 10 Commandments. I mean, Exodus 20, verse 13, you shall not murder. That's Exodus 20, verse 13. So that would be any kind of taking another person's life. Even my my little footnote in my Bible says in Exodus 20, verse 13, the word for murder, it says the Hebrew word also covers causing human death through carelessness or negligence. So really, I mean, really simply, the Bible says you should not murder. You should not take someone else's life. And I would also that includes murdering yourself, like suicide. You shall not murder means you shouldn't kill yourself. So that's, if you wanted a really quick cut and dry answer, is assisted death, is physician-assisted suicide, is euthanasia, is that okay? No, because it's murder. But we can go a little bit deeper than that even. Because it's often kind of said, well, we just want to help reduce suffering. The Bible teaches that suffering is not necessarily something that you should avoid at all costs. The Bible actually says suffering is not necessarily a bad thing. Romans 5:3 says, rejoice in your suffering, knowing that suffering produces endurance. And I don't remember, or you might remember when we went through the book of James. James chapter 1 says, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know the testing your faith produces steadfastness. Let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So in a couple spots in the Bible, we're told suffering is not necessarily something that you should just avoid at all costs, because suffering actually produces Christian maturity so that you can be complete. So I think we need to be really careful when we say we want to help people avoid suffering at all costs. I think one of the best ways that you grow as a Christian is actually through suffering and pain. Now, I know that's hard, for someone who's lying in a hospital bed in pain. They don't want to hear that. Hey, right? Suffering's producing endurance in you. But that's true biblically. Like, we're actually told that we can actually count it joy when we suffer. So I don't think we should be thinking as Christians, how can I help people avoid any and all suffering? We should be as Christians saying, how can I walk with someone through suffering and be a support to them? And then especially suffering that leads to the end of your life, how can I help someone finish their lives well and not just kill them so that they don't suffer anymore? Another angle is people who are in favor of euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, whatever you want to call it. They often cite like, well, you as an individual, you are personally autonomous, you have your freedom of choice. You as an individual, many people argue, you have the right to die when and how you choose. And human dignity is all about that. But I want you to consider a few verses. Job 14, verse 5. Let me find that. Because the idea of like, well, I'm my own autonomous individual. I should be able to decide what I do, when I live, when I die. The Bible would actually disagree with you. Job 14:5 says, "Since his days are determined, and the number of his months is with you," that's with God, "and you have appointed his limits that he cannot pass. Look away and leave him alone, that he may enjoy like a hired hand his day." So Job is saying, my days are determined, right? Since from the moment you breathe your first breath, your days are determined. God knows when you're going to die. He's determined that already. The number of his months is with you. How many months you're going to live, God already knows that. So it's actually not your choice whether you live or die. It's God's choice. And then there's a really interesting couple of verses in the book of Ecclesiastes. So there's one, Ecclesiastes 7:17. It says, "Be not overly wicked, neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time?" So this idea that there's a specific time, right, that God has appointed for you to die. Why should you die before your time? And then even in Ecclesiastes 8, verses 7 and 8, it says, "For he does not know what is to be, for who can tell him how it will be?" And here's really key. "No man has power to retain the spirit or power over the day of death." No man has power over the day of death. So the idea that you as a human being should choose the day that you die, the Bible would say no man has that power. The only person who has that power of when people die is God. So yeah, from a biblical perspective, we would be massively opposed to physician-assisted suicide. It's murder, and no one has the right, even if they're suffering, to decide when they live or die. Only God decides. And as Christians, we should walk with people through pain and suffering and encourage them and help them to finish well. And I don't want in any way to sound like it's going to be easy. It might be very hard and very painful. But I think the Bible would say you do not have a right to take your own life, even if, well, I'm going to die anyways. You don't have that right. So hopefully that makes sense. I know that's kind of a heavy topic to begin with, but comment if you agree or disagree, or if you have a different point of view. I think in the case when someone is, let's say I was in a car accident and I was a vegetable and on life support and zero brain activity, I think there's a difference between my family, for instance, saying, let's take him off life support and just let nature take its course, than someone saying, okay, good. Joni Wolf, what about life support? Yeah, I would say there's a difference there. Because if I have zero brain activity and the doctors have said he's going to be a vegetable for the rest of his life and on life support for the rest of his life because he can't breathe on his own, I think there's a difference between someone saying, I want to kill myself, and someone saying, well, you know what? Take him off life support and we'll just let him pass naturally because are you really alive if you can't live without machines? Like if you can't breathe on your own, if you have zero brain activity. So I think and maybe I'm grasping at straws here, but I think there is a difference there between me going into a doctor, for instance, and saying I have cancer and I don't want to live anymore, kill me, or me being completely brain dead and on life support, and my family saying, you know what, we're just gonna pull the plug, or whatever, however you word it, take him off life support, and let what happens happen. So that would be my opinion. Jennifer says, what about bringing people back? Oh, you mean like if someone is like declared dead and you kind of use the paddles or whatever? Well, I think, yeah, see, you don't want to take what Ecclesiastes and what Job is saying and be like, well, now we can never give CPR because we're going against God's timing. I don't think that's what they mean. What they mean is someone who says, I am going to decide the day that I die. Right? There's a difference between, um, um, sorry, I'll get to your comment there, Richard. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. I think there's, yeah, a difference between, yeah, so reviving is what you're saying, Jennifer. So I think there's a difference. I don't think Ecclesiastes and Job are saying, like, if someone's having a heart attack, you can't give them the defibrillator to save their lives. I don't think that's what it's saying, because it's the way it's worded is it's that I have a choice over my day of death. So yeah, if I had a heart attack and they call the ambulance and I'm dying and they kind of shock me and bring me back to life, if you want to call it that, I don't think that's saying like I have control over my own death. I think that's a different case. And so yeah, if someone's dying and you can give them CPR, or you can give them I have a friend that there was a lady that was overdosing, and he had to give her CPR and then kind of I forget what it's called, but kind of inject her with a thing that kind of restarts you basically, and he saved her life. So I don't think it's kind of like he was playing God. I think that's a different scenario. So Richard, nice to see you on here. I don't think I've ever met you, maybe, but he says maybe that person who takes his or her life wants to save their family from seeing them suffer, give the family a chance to move on. Yeah, that's sometimes the scenarios that I've heard, but I guess that doesn't, if you're coming from a biblical perspective, that doesn't trump the fact that it's still murder. I'm murdering myself. You can paint lots of scenarios about why it's could be considered a really nice thing, but I mean, end of the day, the Bible would say that you have no right as a human being created by God to determine when you die. Only God has that right. So, but I don't want to paint like a picture that this is a really easy decision. That's not what I'm saying. For instance, my grandpa, that would have been last summer, or a summer and a half, so a year and a half ago. He had cancer and died, and it was really hard to watch. I mean, he was in Ontario, so my dad and mom went out, and we FaceTimed him. It was really hard to watch him suffer, but that doesn't negate the fact that he was a Christian man, and he wanted to honor God, and he said God is in control of the timeline, not me. I have no right to take my own life to save you guys grief. And if you ask my dad, they had some really sweet, special times in those last weeks of his life, that amidst really hard pain and suffering, they were able to have some really, really close personal times together that he wouldn't have had if my grandpa had decided, you know what, you can just end my life early. So yeah, Gerald says we're not to play God. Yeah, I would agree. That's kind of bottom line. That's what it really comes down to. God is the creator, and we are his creations. And so it is essentially playing God, saying, I'm autonomous. I have freedom to choose whatever I want. When biblically speaking, it's no, you don't. And then it comes down to a trust thing. Do I trust God in the midst of my suffering? Yeah, Debbie responded to Richard, that's a tough call. Myself, I would rather help the person have as good a death as possible and would suffer more from their choice to take their own life. Yeah. Yeah, I've only ever dealt with this once. There was a man who decided actually not to take his own life, but he was really leaning towards that. And because he was kind of told, you've got 2 months to live, or whatever it was. This was a few years ago, and someone had told him, well, yeah, if you choose not to end your life, God will take away all your pain. And so he actually kind of asked me, and the family asked me, and I said, unfortunately, that's not true. You might be in a lot of pain until you die, but you can still finish well, right? You can still end your life well, and walk through that with your family. And he decided to go ahead and do that. And you know what? By God's grace, he died, I think it was about a week later, with not a ton of pain. And anyways, Jennifer said, what's the consequence? The consequence of, maybe clarify what you mean. The consequence of taking your own life, is that what you mean? I think we talked about this. There was a few episodes or a few Q&As ago. Someone asked about suicide, right? If you commit suicide, are you doomed to hell forever? So if that's what you're asking, again, I maybe I won't repeat myself. I'll really encourage you to go back and listen to that answer about suicide. But uh, no, suicide or murder, when you're murdering yourself, it's a sin, right? But I don't think so. If you're a follower of Jesus and you struggle, and let's say you did that, I don't think it necessarily means that you have no hope. We are welcomed into Jesus's presence because of our faith in Jesus, not because of good or bad that we do, right? So I'm not going to say, yeah, if let's say you suffered from depression and you were on medication and you ended up killing yourself, then there's no hope for you. I'm not going to say that, because I could say the same thing about any other sin, right? If I, committed adultery and then on the way home got hit by a car, would I go to hell because I had sinned? Well, the idea of you don't go to heaven because you were good enough. You go to heaven because you had faith in Jesus. You don't go to hell because you were bad. You go to hell because you chose not to believe in Jesus. So that's a real hard question, but I don't think. Yeah, I guess the consequence is, yeah, it's you're sinning against God, but what the outcome of that is, only God knows. Because yeah, that's a real hard question. Good back and forth. Good, and like I said, this is a big topic. It's legal in Canada, and so we have to wrestle through that. Debbie said, choices can be made with the many drug options we have to help with pain issues or worries about pain. Pain control is such a huge part of the end of life care and can often be managed. Yeah, that's very true. So maybe we'll leave it at that. Hopefully that's answered some of the questions around that. But yeah, maybe we'll move on to the next question. So this person asked, this was from last week, and so they asked, Hebrews 13:12 says, so Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. And so I guess the question, and I kind of reworded it because I couldn't fully remember it, but what does that mean? Jesus suffers outside the gate. Like why? Why in Hebrews 13:12 does it say that? Why so specific? He suffered outside the gate. So this is actually really cool biblically. In John 19, actually in all the Gospels, we're told explicitly that Jesus was crucified outside of the city. He wasn't crucified in Jerusalem. They led him outside of Jerusalem. And he was crucified outside of the city. So, for instance, it says in John 19, so they took Jesus, and he went out, bearing his own cross to the place called the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him two others, one on each side, and Jesus between them. So each gospel account makes this point of saying Jesus was led out of the city and he was crucified outside of the gates of the city. He wasn't crucified inside Jerusalem. Now, when you look at the Old Testament, this is where it gets actually really cool, kind of the foreshadowing. But when the priests would offer sacrifices, when they would kill animals, any leftover flesh from a sacrificed animal was then taken outside of the camp and was burned because it was seen as unclean. So Exodus 29:14 is an example. It says, but the flesh of the bull and its skin and its dung you shall burn with fire outside the camp. It is a sin offering. Um, and then there's a whole bunch of other passages in the Old Testament that talk about things happening outside the gates, outside the camp. In Leviticus 14, if you read, and we won't read all of it, like verses 33 to 45, it talks about laws when there's like leprosy found in a house, basically. Yeah, can you imagine the smell? I know, man. And I often think when Solomon dedicated the temple, they sacrificed like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of animals, and like, can you imagine the sound and the smell? Anyways, so in Leviticus 14, it talks about, if they find leprosy in a house, then the priest goes in and takes the stones, and it says in verse 45, like if they kind of find leprosy all over this house, it says he shall break down the house, its stones and timbers, and all the plaster of the house, and he shall carry them out of the city to an unclean place. Leviticus 4:12 mentions this again, and it says again about a sacrifice. All the rest of the bull he shall carry outside the camp to a clean place, to the ash heap, and shall burn it up on a fire of wood. On the ash heap it shall be burned up. Then if you look in Numbers chapter 5, it talks about the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, command the people of Israel that they put out of the camp everyone who's leprous or has a discharge, or everyone who's unclean through contact with the dead. You shall put out both male and female, put them outside the camp, that they may not defile their camp in the midst of which I dwell. And then last one, Numbers 15, again mentions this like outside the camp. So Numbers 15 verse 32, it says that there was a Sabbath breaker who was found breaking the Sabbath. And it says, the Lord said to Moses, the man shall be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. And all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death with stones. So you have all of these references, right? They would take sacrifices, and anything left over they would take outside the camp and burn it out there. If anyone had, if a house had leprosy in it, they would tear down the house, take all the pieces of the house outside the camp. If there was any unclean people, they were sent outside the camp. And so you have this idea in the Old Covenant, right, that anything unclean, anything ceremonially that's a hard word, unclean, was taken outside the camp, right? It couldn't be in God's presence. It couldn't be, because he's holy, right? So then you have Jesus come, and Jesus is crucified, and he fulfills the entire sacrificial system, right? Because he is the perfect sacrifice for the forgiveness of our sins, and yet he's crucified outside the gate because he became unclean for us, right? He became cast aside for us. He did all of those things for us. So it's actually quite an unbelievable symbolic picture that Jesus was crucified outside of the gates for us. So that idea of being discarded or cast out or rejected, Jesus went through all of that so that you don't have to go through that. Sorry, I'm just reading some of the notes that I wrote. So it's actually quite an amazing picture. I'll go back to Hebrews, because the author of Hebrews kind of goes on and says, so if you read Hebrews 13, verse 11, for the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy places by the high priest as a sacrifice for sins are burned outside the camp. So Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp and bear the reproach he endured. So the author of Hebrews is now encouraging us that we can actually bear suffering and reproach in the name of Jesus. We're going to go join Jesus outside the camp. Isn't that an amazing picture? So he was cast aside, he was rejected, he was killed for us. And now we're encouraged, go join Jesus outside the gate, right? And become outcasts from society and be willing to endure pain and persecution and suffering because of who Jesus is and what he's done for you. So it's a pretty amazing symbolism in the Old Testament that Jesus fulfills. Really cool that Jesus suffered outside the gates for us. So hopefully that made sense. That was the last question. Unless some people have a few more questions, I'll maybe give it like a minute. If you got another question, you can comment in the comments. But if not, that is it. That was a quick one. Yeah, now's your chance. If you have a question, you can type it in there. I will take that silence as no more questions, and that's okay. So if you do end up having questions later on, you can always text our church texting number. Joni always gets her questions in. Who are the seven spirits of God in Revelation? That's a great question. Which chapter is that in, Joni? Is that chapter 5? Does my house smell like gingerbread? No. While Joni tells me what chapter that's in, because I can't remember. We bought a fake tree this year, but we did buy those kind of like tree scent things that you put in there. So it smells like a tree, but not gingerbread. So the seven spirits of God, I believe that is in, there it is, chapter 4. From the throne came flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder, and before the throne were burning 7 torches of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne there was, as it were, a sea of glass like crystal. So how I read the book of Revelation, apocalyptic literature, every number in the book of Revelation is symbolic. I don't think you can read the book of Revelation and say that the numbers are literal, right? Because these numbers are meant to symbolize things. So even think about the mark of the beast, 666. It's not that literally people are going to get 666 marked on their foreheads. 6 is meant to be the number of man, right? Because 7 is kind of the number of God. It's perfection. And 6 is meant to represent the number of man. And when you have 3 of those, it's meant to be kind of like a completeness. So complete man, right? Like the opposite of 777, which would be kind of God, this perfection. And so I'm a firm believer that every number, because apocalyptic literature is meant to work this way, every number in the book of Revelation is meant to not be read literally. Because if you did read it literally, then in Revelation chapter 5, Jesus has 7 horns, 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits. So you go, wait, does Jesus literally have 7 horns and 7 eyes? No, they're representing something. So the number seven is just meant to, oftentimes it's meant to be a number of kind of perfection. And it actually is meant to represent God. So the seven spirits of God doesn't mean literally that God has seven spirits. It's just meant to be this picture of completeness, of wholeness, of perfectness, if that's a word. And so it's the perfect, holy, complete Spirit of God. That's what the number seven means. Same with, 144,000. It's not literally, only 12,000 from each of the tribes. It's meant to be symbolic. All the numbers. That's why I believe the millennium, 1,000 years, it can't be a literal 1,000 years because every other number in the book of Revelation is symbolic. So that's what my answer would be. Is when you read the book of Revelation, you look at these numbers and you go, okay, what do these numbers mean? What do they represent? What is the symbolic, like what am I supposed to be seeing here, right? Because if you read Revelation and everything is literal. So what I mean by literal is that there's literal scorpions coming out of it's crazy, right? So you can't read it like that. It is literally the Word of God, but it's apocalyptic literature, and so it's meant to symbolize different things. So, the seven spirits of God would just be a way to describe the completeness, the holiness, the perfection of the Spirit of God. There's not really seven spirits of God. That'd be quite weird. Then it's not a trinity. It's like 7, 8, 9 of them, but which doesn't make any sense. So hopefully that makes sense. Really good question though. I remember early on when I would read the book of Revelation, I would just read it and go, "What on earth? This is so bizarre. This is so confusing." And so I think I've learned through some really good books and resources that the book of Revelation is not meant to be a confusing book. It's actually meant to be quite an encouraging book and a book about discipleship through hard times. So it's really good to read it the way it was meant to be read. Austin says, speaking of Revelation, can you recommend a resource I can use to help understand why people came up with the idea of the rapture in the last century? Oh man, that's a good question. I'm thinking of a book on my shelf. I just can't think of the name. There is a resource called, I believe it's Kingdom Come. Kingdom Come? Sam Storms. Yeah. So it might not necessarily answer the rapture question, but so Sam Storms is his name. He's a pastor, and he wrote a book called Kingdom Come. And in it, he talks about a theological kind of framework called dispensationalism. And dispensationalism is where the idea of the rapture comes from. And really, the whole reason for the rapture and dispensationalism is to keep Israel and the church separate, right? That God has all of these promises to Israel, and God has to fulfill all these promises to Israel physically and literally. And so then you have these different dispensations where, so God deals with Israel, and then Jesus comes, and now God's dealing with the church. And then to get to the end times, God's got to deal with Israel again. So then, we're going to suck all the Christians out, the rapture. And then God deals with Israel again in that dispensation. So Kingdom Come is a great book. Parts of it are kind of hard to slug through. But he talks a lot about why dispensationalism just doesn't work. It's not actually a biblical theology, because there's so many Bible verses that talk about there is no difference between Israel and the church. There's not meant to be. There's one plan of salvation. And so the rapture, the idea of the rapture kind of fits into that worldview. The reason that the rapture is so kind of you bang that drum is because we have to deal with the church in Israel, right? So we got to somehow suck all the Christians out of the planet so that Jesus can deal with Israel at the end. So that would be one resource. Oh man, what's another one? Uh, yeah, that's the only book that's coming to mind that deals with. So if you just um, if you looked on Amazon, um, actually maybe I won't recommend that because I don't want you to accidentally order something heretical. Why don't I look and I'll look through my library and see if I have anything else that kind of speaks to that topic. But Kingdom Come is one of the books that really helped shape my end time worldview, I guess, and how I view the Book of Revelation and how I view the rapture and all that kind of stuff. Thank you. Trying to understand a counter argument for COVID end times whistleblowers. Good luck. Even the election has been interesting watching. I have heard many Christians talking about Trump and the end times and blah 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 blah. And yeah, I just keep my mouth shut and roll my eyes a little bit. But anyways, we won't get into politics on here. So yeah, I'll look, Austin, and I will see if I have any other resources in my library. But I would really recommend buying that book, Kingdom Come by Sam Storms. So, if there's any other questions, you can go ahead and comment. If not, then maybe we'll be done. Um, yeah, hopefully that's kind of helpful and answers some of the questions you have. Like I said, if you do have questions afterwards, you can always text 778-400-4549. That's our church texting number. Or you can just message us on Facebook. Reminder that tomorrow is Thursday, and at noon, registration for Sunday opens up to everybody. So I would really encourage you, if you haven't been to church in a while, you should come. It's really good to gather together in person. I know people who have been coming are saying, the live stream is really great, thanks for doing it, but there is nothing compared to actually being there and singing and hearing the word in person. So I would really encourage you, if you have been on the fence about going or you've just never gone, I'd really encourage you. Tomorrow you can register. It doesn't matter what your last name starts with. And we still have lots of spots left in the 8 o'clock and the 11:30 service. So hopefully we'll see lots of you this weekend. And thanks for joining me, and we'll talk to you next time.